Idalia is expected to make landfall now as a major hurricane as it approaches the Big Bend area of Florida. Take a look at the current water vapor imagery for Tropical Storm Idalia. We see that it's having a decent amount of convective activity surrounding it. There isn't a ton of rotation just yet, but of course this is about to change. There is a pretty well circulating upper level high just above the center of circulation, which is creating just enough of a nice outflow with the storm. We do see the outflow clouds are moving in all directions, which really shows that there's very good ventilation with this storm, which means that we're more likely to see convective activity and lift surrounding this storm system over the next several hours and even days as this continues to head further northward. There is a pocket of dry air, but I don't think it'll be enough to necessarily weaken or inhibit this storm from rapidly intensifying as it heads further northward, which isn't certainly good news. Currently, its wind speed is right around 65 miles per hour, and it's moving very slowly, but eventually we're going to see a trough move through the eastern half of the United States and eventually steer this up northward. And with very warm water temperatures, a well ventilated storm with a nice upper level high encouraging outflow and not a ton of dry air, it is most likely it'll rapidly intensify. And of course, Idalia isn't the only tropical cyclone we're watching. We're also keeping an eye on Hurricane Franklin, which is now our first major hurricane of the 2023 hurricane season. Its maximum sustained winds are hovering around 145 miles per hour. And if we were to take a look at the water vapor imagery for this storm right now, it's pretty much a textbook-like hurricane. If I were to give you the best description of what an organized hurricane looks like, I'd probably show you this water vapor imagery right here. It's very well organized. We do see the outflow is very there's a ton of outflow with this storm. The outflow is flowing nicely on all sides of the storm, and we're seeing a well-defined center of circulation, and it likely will maintain major hurricane status in the near future. Unfortunately, compared to the previous runs, all the computer models are suggesting that now Tropical Storm Idalia will rapidly intensify as it approaches Florida, because before, only just 2 days ago, this was only anticipated to make landfall potentially as a Category 1 or borderline a Category 2. But now we're seeing that a lot of the computer models want to take a landfall near major hurricane status, which is definitely very, very concerning. While in the 0Z run, we do see the millibar pressure is at 987 millibars, but if we were to take a look at the most recent run of the European model, we see the European model has continuously been dropping the pressure of this storm at landfall, which makes me believe a major hurricane landfall is likely right around the Big Bend area. And that's very concerning, not just due to the wind speed of this storm, but also the storm surge. The Big Bend area is very vulnerable to storm surge because the coast pretty much encourages all the water to funnel in right over the same area due to the bend. That's pretty much forcing the water to funnel in, and that's gonna enhance the storm surge threat even more along the Big Bend coast of Florida, where you could expect anywhere from 7 to 11 feet of storm surge right up along the coast. And this extends further southward down to Tampa Bay, another area that's very vulnerable to storm surge flooding. So you definitely need to prepare up along the Florida coast for potentially major impacts, not just when it comes to wind speed, but storm surge and wind as well. And here's Hurricane Franklin. We do see it's still a very strong storm. The good news is that it's likely going to move out to sea, but this poses a threat to Bermuda. Right now, the European model takes the worst of the storm just north of Bermuda, but Bermuda still could experience very strong winds and heavy rain, even if you don't necessarily directly get impacted or receive a landfall. So you definitely need to pay close attention to that. And going back to Tropical Storm Idalia, which likely will be Hurricane Idalia at this point, we do see that it's going to move up the Carolina coast. So this won't only be a Florida threat. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina will all receive impacts. And with a millibar pressure like this, it could still very well be a hurricane just hugging the Carolinas and could bring storm surge flooding as well as heavy rain and gustier winds. So up along the Carolina coast, you need to pay very close attention to this. And it's pretty much very likely at this point where you're going to see major impacts along Florida. There isn't going to be any major shifts with the forecast. Let's take a look at the height anomaly right now, we do see the main steering flow will be this trough as well as this ridge, and this trough will allow this storm to move further northward, but this ridge will keep it from being able to potentially move out to sea. So we're pretty much inevitably going to see a landfall somewhere along the coast of Florida, and you will experience most likely impacts along the Carolinas. What could make some slight variations in the track is depending on how strong this ridge is, and it also partially depends on Hurricane Franklin, because if Hurricane Franklin ends up weakening this ridge, it could allow Idalia to take more of an eastward track, and that certainly wouldn't be good news for Tampa, because you would experience more impacts on in a scenario where the track moves further eastward, and that would bring more storm surge flooding right around the Tampa Bay area. But if we were to see let's say the ridge a little stronger, the trough a little weaker, then we should see a slower moving storm, which could potentially be even more catastrophic, because then not only would it take a track that would allow it to have more time over water, but it'll most likely move slower as well, so it'll have even more time to intensify as it approaches the Florida coast. So we're definitely going to keep tabs on how the ridging and the trough builds, but it's inevitable that at least somewhere between the Panama City area as far south as Tampa could experience a landfall. I don't expect a landfall to be anywhere outside of just to the south of Tampa or just to the west of Panama City at this point, and this track forecast will play a role along the Carolinas as well. And like I said, it does seem like as much dry air as anticipated will exist over the Gulf of Mexico. It seems like this storm will be able to attain just enough moisture to rapidly intensify. Hopefully, we could see a little bit more dry air in the western half of the Gulf of Mexico that could potentially slow it down just a little bit from rapidly intensifying, but the current consensus is that there's going to be just enough moisture, not enough dry air, based on the recent trends we've been seeing with this storm. It seems like there's a lot less dry air than usual, so I do believe we're going to see rapid intensification as this approaches the Florida coast, and the GFS model agrees with that as well. Here's a forecasted amount of wind shear that's expected over the Gulf of Mexico over the next several days, and we do see it's definitely going to promote a high amount of outflow in the upper levels of this storm, which means that it'll likely rapidly intensify, and the center of circulation will completely be shielded by strong wind shear, which makes me very concerned that maybe we could see even beyond a Category 3 make landfall. It just seems like all signs are pointing towards rapid intensification, and it really and I definitely wouldn't rule out a Category 4 out of this, unfortunately. So the wind shear likely won't be a problem with this storm, and of course warm water temperatures over the Gulf of Mexico will only encourage rapid intensification. The GFS model is expecting much of the same. The upper level wind should promote tropical cyclone development, and the GFS model is even more concerning because we see a 953 millibar storm system just to the south of the Big Bend area of Florida. So if we see this drop down to not the 940s when it comes to millibars, we could potentially see a Category 4 landfall. So you definitely need to prepare accordingly right up along the Big Bend area of Florida. We have to keep in mind the GFS model always been more aggressive when it comes to intensifying this storm. However, the GFS model, at least as of recent, been the more reliable model, because it did forecast a stronger storm to make landfall, which is now likely going to be the case. So there could be a possibility the GFS model might be the more correct one, but again, we can't disregard the European model either. Both computer models are very reliable, so definitely take each one with a grain of salt, but it seems like all signs are pointing towards a major hurricane landfall from the most reliable computer models, which certainly isn't good news. Here are what the ensemble members are stating at this time, and it's pretty much mimicking what the European and GFS model are forecasting. A landfall could happen anywhere just to the north of Tampa Bay and just to the west of Panama City. That seems to be the current consensus and the most likely scenario, so we need to prepare accordingly. There could be slight variations in the track, and that could be huge depending on where you live along the Big Bend area, because that could determine if you experience a life-threatening amount of storm surge, or little to no storm surge at all, depending on which position the wind direction faces in your area. So definitely pay close attention even to the slight changes in the forecast, because the storm surge could change drastically depending on its landfall location. And we see the storm maintains its strength even as it moves over land, over Georgia, South Carolina, and even North Carolina. Expect heavy rainfall and gusty winds. Here's the National Hurricane Center's forecast when it comes to future Hurricane Idalia. We do see that it's, again, mimicking what the ensemble members are stating. The Tampa Bay is right around the cone of uncertainty, so a landfall could potentially be possible, or at least a storm that's close enough to bring potentially life-threatening storm surge flooding. Hurricane warnings are now issued, and you should expect impacts right around Wednesday morning, where a landfall would be the most likely early Wednesday or even late Tuesday, depending on how far east or west the storm moves. So definitely keep that in mind all throughout the Big Bend area of Florida. And we see tropical storm warnings issued a little bit further southward, and tropical storm watches issued for the east coast of Florida, as you certainly aren't spared from the impacts, because the storm will continue to head further northeastward. And I wouldn't be surprised if those tropical storm watches continues to head up the coast towards the Carolinas as well. Thankfully, though, for Hurricane Franklin, it isn't expected to impact the United States, but it could bring potentially impacts towards Bermuda, my bad, right around the Wednesday time frame, where, but it is likely that it'll move just to the north of you guys, which is certainly good news. It'll spare you for the worst of the impacts, but be aware of heavy rainfall and gusty winds throughout the island. Here are what the GFS ensemble members are forecasting over the next 240 hours. And I already talked about Hurricane Franklin and Tropical Storm Idalia enough, but shifting our focus a little bit further eastward, we do have some ensemble members wanting to develop a tropical storm just before it approaches the Caribbean. And in fact, right now there is a 50% chance of tropical cyclone formation right just off the African coast. However, this tropical storm is most likely to move out to sea, but there could be another tropical wave that could come close to the Caribbean in the near future. So definitely be aware of that possibility throughout the islands. Here's a forecasted amount of rainfall for Florida and surrounding areas, and the Big Bend area of Florida and Tampa Bay could experience 6 to 10 inches of rain, which will inevitably cause a high amount of flooding. Flash flooding is likely, I'll say, and this heavy rain extends even further northward up towards the Carolinas and North Carolina, where you could experience anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of rain as this hurricane approaches the coast. So be aware of this possibility. There's a storm surge flooding you should expect throughout Florida, and the worst of it should be, like I said, in the Big Bend area, where all the water will funnel towards this area right here and cause 7 to 11 feet of storm surge flooding. And if you don't know what storm surge is, it's pretty much put yourself on right by the shore over normally dry ground, add 7 to 11 feet on top of that, and that's how much storm surge flooding you should expect. The ocean should be 7 to 11 feet higher than what it is and move up along the coast, which is definitely life-threatening. Remember, it only takes 2 feet of water to completely move a car, so 7 to 11 feet is life-threatening. You need to get away from the coast, and even southward into Tampa Bay, 4 to 7 feet of storm surge flooding is expected, which is definitely definitely enough to cause life-threatening conditions right up along the coast. So keep that in mind. And even further eastward, 2 to 4 feet just north of Jacksonville, 1 to 3 feet right around the Jacksonville metropolitan area, and even as far west as Indian Pass, you could expect 2 to 4 feet of storm surge flooding. So here's the forecast when it comes to the next few tropical cyclones moving through. So major hurricane Idalia is likely. Florida, make sure to prepare. And yeah, just get away from the coast. Make sure to listen to what your local officials are stating, because you definitely don't want to put yourself in a life-threatening situation, especially with storm surge that high. So definitely stay prepared. The certainty is high at this point. You're going to experience major impacts. But that's it for now, guys, and I thank you guys for watching.